Hi there. Welcome to another online video lesson intended to provide you important principles and helpful tips for the study and practice of argumentation. This is the third segment in the second part of our two-part series on the logical importance of evidence. In the past couple of segments, we've looked at four important tests to determine whether or not evidence is sufficient quality to support claims. The tests of reliability, expertise, objectivity, and consistency. In this final segment, we're going to look at the final three tests of evidence discussed by Inch and Tudor in their text Critical Thinking and Communication: relevance, access, and recency. The next test we need to consider is relevance. Whether the evidence is stated as topically and sufficiently related to the claim as made. This is a pretty straightforward test, you might imagine. The idea here is looking at the claim-evidence relationship and trying to determine, if you are to accept a claim, does the evidence that's being used to support the claim have anything really to do with the claim in the first place? Now, you would imagine who in the world would ever want to present evidence that doesn't have anything to do with their claim in order to support their claim? The thing is, it happens a lot. In fact, there's an official term for it that's existed for centuries, the non sequitur. It's a logical fallacy that roughly translated from the Latin means does not follow. Let's look at an example of this from a response that President Trump made to a reporter during a press conference after a state visit by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada early in Trump's presidency.
A little bit of a follow-on my American colleague's question. President Trump, you seem to suggest that Syrian refugees are a Trojan horse for potential terrorism, while the Prime Minister hugs refugees and welcomes them with open arms. So I'd like to know, are you confident the northern border is secure?
Can never be totally confident, but through the incredible efforts already, I see it happening, of formerly General Kelly, now Secretary Kelly. We have really done a great job. We're actually taking people that are criminals, very, very hardened criminals in some cases, with a tremendous track record of abuse and problems, and we're getting them out. And that's what I said I would do. I'm just doing what I said I would do when we won by a very, very large electoral college vote. And I knew that was going to happen. I knew this is what people were wanting. And that wasn't the only reason. That wasn't my only thing that we did so well on, but that was something that was very important. And I said, we will get the criminals out, the drug lords, the gang members. We're getting them out. General Kelly, who's sitting right here, is doing a fantastic job. And I said at the beginning, we are going to get the bad ones, the really bad ones. We're getting them out, and that's exactly what we're doing. I think that in the end, everyone's going to be extremely happy, and I will tell you right now, a lot of people are very, very happy right now.
What we see in this example is that the reporter is asking President Trump a question specifically about Trump's earlier comments that Syrian refugees were potentially a cover identity for ISIS terrorists looking to use refugee status as a means to sneak into the country and engage in terrorist activity. So the reporter asks Trump, are you confident that the northern border of the United States is secure from these refugees that Canada is letting in that might sneak over the border into the United States in order to commit terrorism? And the evidence that Trump provides is essentially a number of things that he has said in the past with regard to the work that he's done on the southern border regarding Mexican gangs and drug cartels, as well as bringing up his electoral college victory in the 2016 presidential election, neither of which have anything to do with Middle Eastern terrorists sneaking in as refugees and coming over the Canadian border. So this is a clear example of a non sequitur fallacy. Now, the thing is, if you're not really carefully listening to the exchange and specifically listening to the question that the reporter is asking and the way that the president answers it, if you're just half listening and you hear what President Trump has to say about how successful his administration has been at protecting the border against crime and violent people, you might get the impression that Trump is providing a strong answer, when in fact he's providing completely irrelevant evidence to support a claim that you're not really encouraged to pay attention to. So we want relevant evidence. The next test to consider is access. Access, simply put, is whether someone offering an opinion is or has been in a position to observe firsthand the matter being disputed. So, in particular, if we want to get reports of a particular event, or we want someone to provide their analysis or their prediction based on their observations, we want to make sure that that person has actually been in a position to make those observations. A primary source, as opposed to a secondary source, someone who's getting that information secondhand from a primary source.
Bueller, Bueller, Bueller.
He's sick. My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious.
Thank you, Simone.
No problem whatsoever.
Fry.
For instance, as I briefly mentioned in our previous video on evidence, courts of law rely heavily on eyewitness testimony to determine the facticity of events. But hearsay evidence, evidence that comes from a witness that did not witness things firsthand but actually heard about the account of events from somebody else, that's evidence that's inadmissible in a court of law, because hearsay evidence is incredibly inaccurate most of the time. Indeed, the research tells us that in civil and criminal courts, firsthand eyewitness testimony itself can be problematic in a lot of instances, but it's clearly superior to hearsay evidence, which is just really unreliable. Another way we can think about access is the difference between a researcher that communicates the results of a scientific study as opposed to a journalist who's reporting on that study. The researcher is in a better position of access. They're the primary source because they actually conducted the study, wrote up the results, and had them published, as opposed to the journalist who's a secondary source who's reading the study or perhaps reading a press release about that study, which is essentially hearsay based on a primary source. So the problem here is that the journalist may not be getting all of the information right because they not only don't have the expertise of the researcher, but they also weren't in a position to actually observe what was going on in the first place, so they have less of a clear understanding of what's happening. This particular issue was covered on a recent episode of John Oliver's HBO television show, talking specifically about a 2016 study from the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynaecology. What the study was involved with was looking at the differences between two different kinds of chocolate that had different levels of biochemical in them, specifically a compound called flavanol. And it was a very specific preliminary trial to see if high flavanol versus low flavanol chocolate had any kind of connection to the rate of preeclampsia or high blood pressure in pregnant women. What's important to note is that the study was just looking at the difference between these two different kinds of chocolate, not looking at rates of preeclampsia between folks who ate chocolate and folks who didn't. What's interesting about this study is that it was reported in a press release by the Society for Maternal and Fetal Medicine with the title "The Benefits of Chocolate During Pregnancy." The press release, which was summing up and providing publicity for the scientific study, was really misrepresenting what the study was actually saying. It wasn't necessarily the case that the relationship between chocolate and pregnancy benefits wasn't talked about at all in the study, but it clearly was not one of the findings that the researchers actually concluded. Still, what happened after the press release of the study came about is that it got a lot of coverage in print and television news, as well as on the internet. For instance, here's one story from Fit Pregnancy and Baby website with the title, "There's a Good Reason to Eat Chocolate While Pregnant." And at one point in the article, it provides the following. According to its double-blind trial, chocolate can improve placental function and decrease your risk of preeclampsia. The researchers studied 129 women who were between 11 and 14 weeks pregnant. Half the women were fed low flavanol chocolate. The other half ate high flavanol chocolate. The women all consumed 30 grams of chocolate a day. Okay, first of all, I can't eat just 30 grams of chocolate at a sitting. I don't know about you, but that's irrelevant. Okay, let's get back to work. Look at the following. Half the women were fed low flavanol chocolate, the other half ate high flavanol chocolate. What you'll notice here is that there's, as John Oliver pointed out in his expose of this particular study, there was no control group that looked at the rates of preeclampsia for women who didn't eat any chocolate at all, because that wasn't the focus of this specific clinical trial. All they were trying to do was look at the difference in flavanol level and rates of preeclampsia. But what happens when it goes from the study to the press release to this particular piece of journalism about the study is that somehow it turns into a study finding that chocolate decreases risk of preeclampsia. Now, why this is problematic is because when the lead researcher of this study was interviewed by Medical News Today in 2016, Dr. Emmanuel Bujold said the following. We cannot speculate on the overall effect of chocolate on the risk of preeclampsia from our study results because we did not have a group of women who were not taking chocolate. He goes on to actually do a little bit of speculation to say that we need to do more study on this because there are some findings that might potentially move in this area. But it is not a finding of this study, and the researchers specifically came out against the claim that they were making this finding. However, that's not what we got in the journalistic coverage of this issue. And the reason for this problem on a variety of levels boils down to this test of access. The public relations professional that wrote the press release about the study did not have the access and subsequently the clear understanding of what the study was actually about that the researchers had, because the researchers were the primary source. They had the best access to what was being observed and what it meant. And so the PR person writing the press release is a step removed from that. And then the news outlets that used the press release material as the basis of stories had even less access to the specific observations in the study. Indeed, it's safe to say that most of the journalists who reported on this particular study, in all likelihood, probably didn't read the story at all. And you can't necessarily blame them for that because that's not necessarily how they do their job because they are not scientists. They rely on press releases about scientific studies in order to do their work. So what does this mean? Well, essentially the bottom line is you need to be careful whenever evidence sources are talking about areas that might potentially involve some expertise or are talking about observations of reality that require certain levels of access, being able to be in a position to observe things for themselves. Anytime you get a step away and get the information secondhand or even thirdhand, the potential of reliable information decreases. So while secondary sources can be great sources of information, primary sources tend to be better, not just because they may have better expertise, but also because they have better access to the reality that they're talking about. Finally, we need to talk about the test of recency. The recency test is pretty straightforward. Is the evidence source sufficiently current on the topic of their argument? And this test can be especially important whenever arguments are being made about issues with regard to science and technology, or issues that are current events in the political or social or cultural milieu of the time. We want to make sure that the evidence that we're presenting to back up our claims hasn't been disproven by some scientific or technological advances or to more recent developments in current events that make our older evidence incorrect and irrelevant. Now, on certain topics, especially when we're arguing on questions with regard to fields like history and philosophy, the recency of the evidence isn't necessarily as important. If I'm making arguments about the kinds of things that Aristotle is talking about in his treatise on rhetoric, and I happen to be quoting a scholar from the 1980s or 90s, it's not necessarily outdated information. There may be other takes on what Aristotle was saying that could have been published a little bit later, but that doesn't necessarily disprove what was being said before, because all of them are still looking back thousands of years to try to figure out what's going on. But whenever we're talking about time-sensitive issues, we need to really take recency into account. One pervasive problem of arguments that disregard the test of recency when relying on evidence unfortunately occurs in the field of education when we look at the study and pedagogical practice revolving around the concept of learning styles.
Learning styles are a complete myth. Say what? It's true, but I'll get to that in a moment. First of all, what are learning styles? Unless you've slept through every single class you've ever attended, you'll know it's the idea that everyone has a preferred way to take in information. If you're taught or you study using your preferred style, you'll learn more effectively. This idea has been around since the 1970s, and it's been continued on by well-meaning teachers and diligent students aiming for effective learning. We all want to learn faster and more effectively. That's no surprise. Unfortunately, there is no credible evidence that learning styles exist. In fact, the best evidence indicates the opposite. Every student will have different levels of ability, interest, and background knowledge, but not learning styles. Research shows that when people have a favourite style of presentation, it's usually a preference for a type of task or subject they have a high ability for and already feel successful at. If you're good at music, you might think you're an auditory learner. Or if you're artistic, you might think you're a visual. You might prefer to learn in a particular way, but there's no evidence that it will help you learn more effectively. When researchers now look at students who are using their preferred style, the results of those students aren't any better than students who are not using their preferred style. But here's the really crazy thing. Up to 90% of teachers still believe learning styles are real.
Okay, so here's the problem. As the video points out, the idea of learning styles gets developed initially with research taking place in the 1970s. The idea really ends up picking up steam, and the most prominent theories in the contemporary thoughts on learning styles come from Kolb's Learning Style Inventory that gets published in 1984, as well as what many of you might be familiar with your own experiences in K through 12 education regarding the matrix of visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and reading and writing learning styles that come from Barbie and Associates back in 1979. And versions of these inventories and typologies for learning styles continue to be developed even as recently as 2014. But here's the problem. What we find out when folks in educational psychology actually took a really close look at the research regarding the connection between learning styles and actual learning outcomes, we find something problematic. An important study was published by Pashler and Associates in 2008 in the journal Psychological Science in the Public Interest. They did a massive analysis of all of the available research literature that had been conducted regarding learning styles and whether or not teaching with regard to learning styles had any impact on the way that students actually learned. And here's the key finding as reported by the Association for Psychological Science in 2009. No less than 71 different models of learning styles have been proposed over the years. Most have no doubt been created with students' best interests in mind and to create more suitable environments for learning. But psychological research has not found that people learn differently, at least not in the ways learning styles proponents claim. Given the lack of scientific evidence, the authors argue that the currently widespread use of learning style tests and teaching tools is a wasteful use of limited educational resources. Now, that is pretty damning criticism. The problem is that many, if not most, K through 12 teachers that go through college education and certification programs are often taught using textbooks written by experts and mentored by currently practicing teachers who came of age and developed their own expertise in education when the learning styles theory was really still a thing. And so even to this day, current K through 12 teachers espouse the importance of learning styles and even talk about this theory with their students to explain why they're teaching the way that they're teaching. And primarily what they're doing is they are relying on outdated evidence. They're relying on things coming out of textbooks and coming out of studies that are cited in those textbooks that came out well before the 2008 meta-analysis that essentially concluded that all of this is crap and that learning styles really don't improve learning outcomes for kids. So recency is going to be really important. We need to pay attention whenever we're looking at evidence that's purporting to provide some kind of research-based grounding for a claim that's being made. Is that research the most current and subsequently the most accurate and the most reliable form of that evidence? Because if it's too old, it's very possible that it might have been scooped or even debunked by more recent research or observations. And so if you're relying on old information that's not accurate anymore, that's problematic evidence, and that's not going to be helpful to support your claim. So to summarize, in this lesson we've looked at 7 important rules of thumb for testing evidence. Not only for when you're constructing your own arguments, but also, and very importantly, when you're analyzing and evaluating arguments made by others. We need to think about the reliability, expertise, objectivity, consistency, relevance, access, and recency of the evidence and the sources from which they come. And we have to ask ourselves, is this the best available evidence? What kinds of critical questions do I have about this evidence? And what kind of other sources might I want to look into in order to determine whether or not I can count on this evidence as providing sound and reasonable support for the claim? And a big takeaway from all of these tests is that whether or not evidence passes the test is often going to depend on the context of the argument to determine whether or not a source is relevant, whether a source has the expertise or the objectivity involved, whether or not the information is sufficiently recent or consistent with external sources is going to depend on what we're arguing about and what kind of evidence does or doesn't count in this situation. As always, if you have any questions about this material or how it might apply to arguments in your own life, please don't hesitate to reach out and I can help out in any way I can. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.